Chapter 13, 52. In the black prison of the Conciergerie, the doomed of the day awaited their fate. They were in number as the weeks of the year. 52 were to roll that afternoon, on the life tide of the city to the boundless, everlasting sea. Before their cells were quit of them, new occupants were appointed. Before their blood ran into the blood spilled yesterday, the blood that was to mingle with theirs tomorrow was already set apart. 212 were told off, from the farmer general of 70, whose riches could not buy his life, to the seamstress of 20, whose poverty and obscurity could not save her. Physical diseases, engendered in the vices and neglects of men, will seize on victims of all degrees, and the frightful moral disorder, born of unspeakable suffering, intolerable oppression, and heartless indifference, smote equally without distinction. So here what this paragraph is telling us is that 52 are set to die on the same day as Charles Darnay. And that there are some who, according to the revolution at its start, deserved, quote unquote, deserved to die because they were of the ruling class before the revolution. But there are also people who, there's a seamstress of 20 years old who, she did nothing, she owes nothing, and yet she's also being killed on that day. So that's what it's saying here, is that no one is safe from this this death. Picking up with Charles Darnay. Charles Darnay, alone in a cell, had sustained himself with no flattering delusion since he came to it from the tribunal. In every line of the narrative he had heard his condemnation. He had fully comprehended that no personal influence could possibly save him, that he was virtually sentenced by the millions, and that units could avail him nothing. Nevertheless, it was not easy, with the face of his beloved wife fresh before him, to compose his mind to what it must bear. His hold on life was strong, and it was very, very hard to loosen. By gradual efforts and degrees, unclosed a little here, it clenched the tighter there, and when he brought his strength to bear on that hand and it yielded, this was closed again. There was a hurry, too, in all of his thoughts, a turbulent and heated working of his heart that contended against his resignation. If, for a moment, he did feel resigned, then his wife and child who had to live after him seemed to protest and to make it a selfish thing. So here Charles Darnay is trying to reconcile with himself that he's going to die, and he tries to resign himself to it, but every time that he gets close to accepting his fate, he thinks of Lucy and little Lucy and decides that he kind of has to fight again. But all this was at first. Before long, the consideration that there was no disgrace in the fate he must meet, and that numbers went the same road wrongfully and trod it firmly every day, sprang up to stimulate him. Next followed the thought that much of the future peace of mind enjoyable by his dear ones depended on his quiet fortitude. So by degrees he calmed into the better state, when he could raise his thoughts much higher and draw comfort down. So here he finally decides that he has to meet his fate with resignation, with peace, so that his wife and child don't see him go to his death in fear, so that that last picture of him that they have is not necessarily positive, but not as negative as it could be in this situation. Before it had set in dark on the night of his condemnation, he had traveled thus far on his last... Sorry, I got lost in my paper. I'm going to start back. Before it had set in dark on the night of his condemnation, he had traveled thus far on his last way. Being allowed to purchase the means of writing and a light, he sat down to write until such a time as the prison lamp should be extinguished. He wrote a long letter to Lucy, showing her that he had known nothing of her father's imprisonment until he had heard of it from herself, and that he had been as ignorant as she of his father's and uncle's responsibility for that misery until the paper had been read. He had already explained to her that his concealment from herself of the name he had relinquished was the one condition, fully intelligible now, that her father had attached to their betrothal, and was one promise he had still exacted on the morning of their marriage. He entreated her, for her father's sake, never to seek to know whether her father had become oblivious of the existence of the paper, or had had it recalled to him, for the moment or for good, by the story of the tower on that old Sunday under the dear old plane tree in the garden. So what he's talking about here in this letter is he's asking Lucy not to ask if Dr. Manette thought about the paper that he had written, and remembering long ago, kind of at the start of book the second, Darnay relays a story that he heard while he was imprisoned in the Tower of London of them finding a letter. And that kind of foreshadowed the letter that that Dr. Manette had hidden in his cell. So that's what this is talking about. So he's basically trying to make certain that Lucy doesn't even inadvertently blame her father for her husband's death. Picking up with if he had preserved any definite remembrance of it, there could be no doubt that he had supposed it destroyed with the Bastille, when he had found no mention of it among the relics of the prisoners which the populace had discovered there, and which had been described to all the world. He besought her, though he added that he knew it was needless, to console her father by impressing him through every tender means she could think of with the truth that he had done nothing for which he could justly reproach himself, but had uniformly forgotten himself for their joint sakes. Next, to her preservation of his own last grateful love and blessing, and her overcoming of her sorrow to devote herself to their dead child, he abjured her, as they would meet in heaven, to comfort her father. To her father himself he wrote in the same strain, but he told her father that he expressly confided his wife and child to his care, and he told him this very strongly, with the hope of rousing him from any despondency or dangerous retrospect towards which he foresaw he might be tending. To Mr. Lorry he commended them all, and explained his worldly affairs. That done, with many added sentences of grateful friendship and warm attachment, all was done. He never thought of Carton. His mind was so full of the others that he never once thought of him. So Darnay writes 3 letters on the night before he's to be executed. They are to Lucy saying, I need you to reassure your father that he did nothing wrong. I need you to be kind to your father and help him through this. And I need you to be kind to yourself. I need you to stay alive, stay healthy for the child that we still have on earth. And then he writes a letter to Dr. Manette saying the same thing. I need you to understand that you did nothing wrong, he says. There's nothing that you ever did that wasn't for the good of me and Lucy. So don't be sad, and also take care of Lucy and little Lucy. And then to Mr. Lorry, he writes a letter basically explaining his last will and testament. These are all the monies that we have. This is what I'm leaving to my wife and child. And Sidney Carton has just never thought of it. It doesn't even cross Darnay's mind. Picking up with he had time. He had time to finish these letters before the lights were put out. When he lay down on his straw bed, he thought he had done with this world. But it beckoned him back in his sleep and showed itself in shining forms. Free and happy, back in the old house in Soho, though it had nothing in it like the real house. Unaccountably released and light of heart, he was with Lucy again, and she told him that it was all a dream and he had never gone away. A pause of forgetfulness, and then he had even suffered, and he had come back to her, dead and at peace, and yet there was no difference in him. Another pause of oblivion, and he woke in the somber morning, unconscious where he was or what had happened, until it flashed upon his mind, this is the day of my death. So he goes to sleep that night, and he dreams, and then he wakes, and then he dreams, and then he wakes, and then he dreams. And this last time when he wakes up, he's not sure where he was because his dreams were so good, and he realizes that he's in prison and he's going to die. Picking up with thus. Thus had he come through the hours to the day when the 52 heads were to fall. And now, while he was composed and hoped that he could meet the end with quiet heroism, a new action began in his waking thoughts which was very difficult to master. He had never seen the instrument that was to terminate his life. How high it was from the ground, how many steps it had, where he would be stood, how he would be touched, whether the touching hands would be dyed red, which way his face would be turned, whether he would be the first or might be the last. These and similar questions, in no wise directed by his will, obtruded themselves over and over again countless times. Neither were they connected with fear. He was conscious of no fear. Rather, they originated in a strange besetting desire to know what to do when the time came. a desire gigantically disproportionate to the few swift moments to which it referred, a wondering that was more like the wondering of some other spirit within his than his own. The hours went on as he walked to and fro, and the clock struck the numbers he would never hear again. 9 gone forever. 10 gone forever. 11 gone forever. 12 coming on to pass away. After a hard contest with the eccentric action of thought which had last perplexed him, he had got the better of it. He walked up and down, softly repeating the names to himself. The worst of his strife was over. He could walk up and down, free from distracting fancies, praying for himself and for them. 12 gone forever.